Picture this. You're standing in the grand halls of medieval Europe, surrounded by the finest silks and glittering jewels, watching what appears to be a fairy tale wedding. The bride is barely 14 years old, draped in the most exquisite gown money can buy, her face painted with the delicate cosmetics reserved for royalty. But as you look closer at this seemingly magical ceremony, something makes your stomach turn. The man taking her hand in marriage, the one who will share her bed and control every aspect of her life, is her own uncle. What you're witnessing isn't a celebration of love, it's the systematic destruction of a child's innocence in the name of political power. Before we dive into this forgotten story of medieval politics and human suffering, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden behind royal glamour, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know what country you're watching from. It amazes me that we can explore these tragic historical events together from every corner of the world, connected by our shared need to understand how power has shaped human lives across centuries. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess or political maneuvering. It's the story of how a child became a pawn in a game she never understood, how family bonds were twisted into chains of control, and how an entire kingdom watched as innocence was sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The name Princess Isabella might not mean much to you now, but her story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about medieval marriage and royal duty. Let's begin with the world that created this tragedy. Medieval Europe in the 13th century wasn't just a different time, it was an entirely different moral universe. Children weren't seen as individuals with rights and dreams, but as valuable assets to be traded, married off, and used to secure alliances that could determine the fate of entire nations. Royal daughters especially existed in a strange limbo where they were simultaneously precious and expendable, treasured for their bloodline but utterly powerless over their own destinies. In this world, marriage had nothing to do with love, compatibility, or even basic human decency. It was pure business, conducted with the cold calculation of a financial transaction. Kings and nobles would negotiate marriages like modern corporations negotiate mergers, weighing the strategic advantages, considering the dowries, and evaluating how each union might strengthen their position against rivals. The bride and groom were often the last people consulted about their own wedding, but even by medieval standards, what happened to Princess Isabella was shocking. Born into the royal house of Aragon in 1248, she entered a world where her fate was decided before she could even walk. Her father, King James I, was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, ruling over territories that stretched from Spain into the Mediterranean. Her mother, Queen Yolanda, came from Hungarian nobility, bringing with her connections that made young Isabella even more valuable on the international marriage market. From the moment of her birth, Isabella was never just a child. She was a diplomatic tool, a living treaty waiting to be signed. Courtiers would study her features as she grew, evaluating her beauty as if appraising a precious gemstone. They monitored her health with the intensity of merchants protecting their most valuable cargo. Every aspect of her development was scrutinized because her marriageability would determine not just her own future, but potentially the balance of power across Europe. Isabella's childhood was spent in the royal palaces of Aragon, surrounded by luxury that most people couldn't even imagine. She learned to read and write in multiple languages, studied music and poetry, and received instruction in the delicate arts of royal deportment. But beneath all this refinement lay a darker education. She was being trained to be the perfect royal bride, taught to be charming, obedient, and above all, useful to whatever man would eventually claim her. What made Isabella particularly valuable wasn't just her royal blood, but her position in the complex web of European politics. Her father's kingdom controlled crucial trade routes and strategic territories that every major power coveted. An alliance through marriage with Aragon could shift the entire balance of medieval Europe. This made the young princess simultaneously one of the most sought-after brides on the continent and one of the most vulnerable children in the known world. As Isabella approached adolescence, the negotiations began in earnest. Ambassadors from across Europe arrived at her father's court, each representing kings and princes, eager to secure an alliance through marriage to the Aragonese princess. These weren't romantic courtships. They were brutal negotiations where Isabella's value was calculated like a commodity. Her dowry was discussed in precise detail, her bloodline was analyzed for political advantages, and her future fertility was evaluated as if she were livestock being prepared for breeding. But there was one suitor whose interest in Isabella carried a particularly sinister undertone. Her uncle, Prince Alfonso, had been watching his young niece with an attention that went far beyond familial affection. Alfonso wasn't just any relative, he was her father's younger brother, a man who had spent years building his own power base and harboring ambitions that extended far beyond his current station. In Isabella, he saw not just a path to greater political influence, but an opportunity to bind himself permanently to the royal succession. The idea of uncle-niece marriages wasn't entirely unheard of in medieval Europe, though it was controversial even by the standards of the time. The Catholic Church officially prohibited such unions, considering them incestuous, but royal families had ways of obtaining special dispensations when political necessity demanded it. What made Alfonso's pursuit of Isabella particularly disturbing wasn't just the blood relationship, but the massive age gap and power imbalance that would define their union. Alfonso was already in his 30s when he began seriously pursuing marriage to his teenage niece. He had experience in politics, warfare, and the brutal realities of medieval power. Isabella, meanwhile, was still learning basic courtly etiquette and had never been allowed to make a significant decision about her own life. The proposed marriage wasn't just between relatives, it was between a seasoned political operator and a child who had no understanding of what she was being asked to sacrifice. The negotiations for this unholy alliance began in secret, conducted in the shadowed corridors of the royal palace where even the most hardened courtiers whispered their concerns. Alfonso had spent months carefully positioning himself, using his influence as the king's brother to eliminate other potential suitors. He spread rumors about the instability of foreign alliances, questioned the loyalty of distant princes, and systematically convinced his brother that keeping Isabella within the family was the safest course of action. What Alfonso understood, and what made his manipulation so effective, was that King James was growing increasingly paranoid about external threats. The political landscape of 13th century Europe was shifting rapidly, with new alliances forming and dissolving almost monthly. The king had watched other monarchs lose power through disadvantageous marriages, and Alfonso skillfully exploited these fears, painting himself as the only truly trustworthy option for his brother's precious daughter. The psychological manipulation was masterful and deeply disturbing. Alfonso presented himself as Isabella's protector, the one man who would never use her solely for political gain because of their family bond. He convinced the king that foreign princes would treat Isabella as nothing more than a political pawn, while he, as her uncle, would cherish and protect her. The cruel irony was that Alfonso was planning to exploit Isabella more thoroughly than any foreign suitor ever could, precisely because their family connection would make her resistance impossible. When the proposal was finally made official, Isabella was summoned to her father's private chambers. She entered expecting perhaps a discussion about her education or some minor court matter, but instead found herself facing the two most powerful men in her life, both staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Her father began speaking about duty, about the sacred responsibilities of royal blood, about sacrifices that must be made for the good of the kingdom. Isabella listened in growing horror as the terms of her fate were laid out with bureaucratic precision. She would marry her uncle Alfonso within 6 months. The wedding would be a grand affair, demonstrating the unity of the royal family and the strength of their dynasty. She would move to Alfonso's estates immediately after the ceremony, where she would begin her duties as his wife and eventually the mother of his children. The young princess tried to speak, tried to voice the confusion and fear that were overwhelming her, but her words were dismissed before she could fully form them. Her father reminded her that royal children didn't have the luxury of personal preferences, that her individual desires meant nothing compared to the stability of the realm. Alfonso, meanwhile, watched her distress with what he probably imagined was paternal kindness, but which was actually the satisfied expression of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. The months leading up to the wedding were a nightmare of preparation disguised as celebration. Isabella was fitted for increasingly elaborate gowns, each more restrictive than the last, as if the very fabric was designed to constrain her growing desperation. She endured endless lessons in household management, learning how to oversee the domestic affairs of a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. Most disturbing of all, she received instruction in what were euphemistically called wifely duties, conversations that left her pale and trembling with the realization of what her future would actually entail. Throughout this period, Alfonso made increasingly frequent visits to court, ostensibly to discuss wedding arrangements, but really to establish his ownership over his future bride. He would sit uncomfortably close to Isabella during meals, comment on her appearance with an intimacy that made everyone present shift awkwardly in their seats, and speak about their future together with assumptions that betrayed his complete disregard for her consent. The wedding day itself was a masterpiece of royal pageantry built on a foundation of human misery. The cathedral was filled with the most powerful nobles in Europe, all come to witness what they publicly called a blessed union, but privately recognized as something far more sinister. Isabella walked down the aisle in a gown that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime, her face painted with cosmetics that couldn't quite hide her pallor, her hands trembling so violently that the royal jewelers had to design special clasps to keep her rings from falling off. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional rituals, but those who knew what to look for could see the horror beneath the grandeur. When Alfonso took Isabella's hand, she flinched visibly. When the priest asked for her consent, her voice was barely audible, and many guests later claimed they weren't certain she had actually agreed. The kiss that sealed their union lasted far longer than appropriate, with Alfonso demonstrating his possession of his new wife in a way that made even medieval nobles uncomfortable. The wedding feast that followed was a grotesque celebration where Isabella sat silent and motionless while her new husband made increasingly inappropriate toasts about their future happiness. She barely touched the exotic delicacies prepared for the occasion, and several guests noted that she appeared to be in a state of shock, responding to direct questions with blank stares or single-word answers. What happened to Isabella after that night remains largely hidden in historical shadows, but the fragments we can piece together paint a picture of systematic abuse disguised as marital devotion. She disappeared from court records for months at a time, emerging only for ceremonial occasions where she appeared increasingly fragile and withdrawn. The few letters that survive from this period, written in her own hand, speak of loneliness, confusion, and a growing sense that she had somehow ceased to exist as an individual person. Isabella's story ended tragically but perhaps mercifully early. She died at just 19 years old, officially from complications during childbirth, though some historians suggest the circumstances were more complex. Her death freed her from a marriage that had destroyed her spirit long before it claimed her life, but it also ensured that her voice was silenced forever, her experiences reduced to footnotes in the chronicles of more powerful men. The story of Princess Isabella forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power operates across history. Her tragedy wasn't an aberration, it was the logical conclusion of a system that treated children as property and women as commodities. Her suffering reminds us that behind every grand historical narrative lie individual human stories of pain, resistance, and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion, even across the vast gulf of 8 centuries.